Want to start by welcoming everybody to today's global talk. I know I'm not the usual, face of the introduction and moderation, but unfortunately, our director Cynthia Milton is homesick. I do think she's here on Zoom, and so she asked me to moderate and hold the space here today for Gustav's global talk. So thanks, Cynthia, and I hope you're feeling okay there. I am Laura Brandis, and I'm the Communications Director at the Polis Project on Ecological Governance. We're one of the ongoing interdisciplinary projects housed here at the Center for Global Studies. And there's obvious links between the work we do and some of the themes that Gustav will be talking about here today. So before I introduce this guy behind me, next slide. I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples, also known as the Songhees and Kokapsum or Esquimalt peoples, on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. Let's bring this one. All right. Well, I have met Gustav for all of about 10 seconds, but he's given me good vibes. And I also was thrilled to learn just now that my good friend here, Zach, who's in the engineering department, was somehow key in getting Gustav here. So this seems like good. I love when seemingly disparate worlds collide. So all that to say, I'm honored to be introducing Gustav Osberg here today. And as I said, I certainly have a personal interest in some of the themes that we're going to hear. Clear links to the themes of ecological governance that our team at Polis is interested in. Gustav is an interdisciplinary doctoral researcher joining us from Lund University in Sweden, and he also has a background in global studies. And in his dissertation, he's seeking to integrate insights from a few different fields of research: social psychology, inner transformations, and political economy, to offer a lens for examining how things like governance structures, institutional arrangements, and power dynamics can enable or constrain our personal commitments to co-creating sustainable futures. And as I understand it, Gustav, today you're specifically going to be sharing about how collective climate action is shaped not only by fixed elements, things like policies and targets, by also what he terms softer personal dimensions. So this gets into the realm of things like participation, values, motivation, relationships, and notions of shared meaning. And we're going to learn how participatory governance can nurture engagement, and he'll show us how a social psychological empowerment perspective when it comes to collaboration contrasts with incentive or information-based approaches when it comes to actually taking and motivating climate action. So that's the setup, and I'm going to hand it over to you. And then at the end, write down your questions as you have them, and we'll have time for a good Q&A after his talk. So please, Gustav, take it away.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Now, hearing this introduction, it's like, how did I promise too much? But yeah, so as mentioned, Gustav from Lund University, International Institute of Industrial and Environmental Economics. Kind of like a similar center to this. I get the vibes that it's kind of doesn't belong to a faculty. It's quite emphasis on research, interdisciplinary, and we have 2 master's programs. We were formed back in '94, so it's as old as me. So kind of, yeah, as presented in this talk, I kind of wanted to share this idea, which I've chosen to term soft forms within fixed frames. Kind of building on the idea that at least in the EU, with some backlash, of course, the kind of policy frameworks are getting more precise and more kind of mainstream, and we can quantify what we kind of want to achieve in terms of emissions reductions and maybe nature conservation, that sort of stuff. But in terms of actually implementing these bold ambitions, we also need to pay attention to the soft forms of participation and the personal dimensions of sustainability. And that's kind of what my work seeks to do. But to understand the soft dimension, since I have a bit of time, which I'm not used to, but I kind of situate my work in a bigger theoretical puzzle and tradition, starting with this kind of slide that each kind of way of doing governance, approaches, paradigms, and so on rests on a basic set of assumptions, of course, which has to do fundamentally, and most importantly in my case, about the social and the human. Assumptions about our motivations, our agency, what motivates people to actually act, and how we can actually mobilize people to pursue the future that is deemed desirable. And then that, of course, has implications for how we organize ourselves politically, and for stuff like human and nature relationships. A kind of classic example of this, just going to frame it in a hopefully familiar metaphor, is of course the tragedy of the commons. Today quite disregarded, but still kind of carrying a kind of cultural impact and legacy on our imagination about how to address environmental issues. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. It's from Harding's essay from 1968, I think, where he uses this example of a communing grazing field where more and more farmers are adding animals to the pasture, and eventually it collapses, based on the idea that the gains are kind of goes back to the individual, but the burden and the consequences are shared by all. And then, of course, based on this reasoning by metaphors, he writes these set of policy suggestions, you could call them, I guess. And of course, they could be summarized in the way he summarized himself: mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. That's the kind of only way out. So regulation, property rights, economic instruments, those kind of things. And this, of course, is not like, didn't emerge out of a vacuum. It kind of connects to a longer kind of political science tradition of different ideas, such as the Leviathan, this big Leviathan, this mythical beast that Hobbes talks about, that we need to, hand over some of our rights, some of our freedoms to the sovereign in order to have a civilized life, basically, arguing that the state of nature is a state of war, and so on. So kind of here again, we have this assumption about human nature being, if left to our own devices, we will only kind of engage in warfare, in pillaging, and in other sorts of bad things. And this, of course, echoes to today. You have, for example, this book on the climate Leviathan, where these authors kind of narrates one possible future of a big global Leviathan to manage Earth's resources, basically, as one way out of the crisis. And then, of course, as a kind of counterpoint, you have Adam Smith, which is also a big influence on the disciplines of economics and, in some sense, political science as well, where he argued, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So here again, but it's maybe more of an optimistic tone to leaving people to their own devices and just letting kind of human nature play its part in organizing. Harding, of course, rejected Adam Smith, but especially in economics, this is kind of still a very, especially in neoclassical schools, a very big influence. But there's, of course, a common assumption here, which is that drum roll, that people are self-interested and you will use more than their fair share to their own devices. So here we have kind of three big assumptions that I think still kind of plagues a lot of the especially economics today, like a very limited understanding of human agency, human motivations, notions such as homo economicus, rational choice, that people, will, with access to information, will act rationally on the information they have, and kind of pursue their own interests and maximize own utilities, basically. But then, of course, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, if you actually, and in Austria making this big contribution, going out in the field, looking at actual cases, not just this kind of metaphors taking out of thin air, to look at how people actually organize around common pool resources. And if you do this, you kind of arrive at a very different way, different kind of assumption that you can have about humans and their motivations and their capacities to organize and build social norms of cooperation, basically. So this kind of broke this, line of thinking, and I guess that's the major takeaway from that. But why am I talking about this? Because, assumptions have consequences for policy and practice. again, if we have this quite limited view of people as self-interested, only looking to their own utility and self-regard, then we will design policies that kind of addresses those limited aspects. Here are 3 papers that kind of points to this. The policies designed for self-interested citizen may undermine their moral sentiments. This is known under crowding out theory. And another one for management science, which kind of looks at managers' assumptions about how to motivate workers to perform their task. And conventionally, the kind of managerial perspective is that you need carrots or whips to motivate people to do their work. Yeah, and then this article basically arguing that we actually need to understand better the relationship between the type of policies and the kind of motivations it fosters. And that's the kind of point of departure for my research. And if you look at traditional policy types, you can see these 3: carrots, sticks, and sermons. Perhaps nudging could be added to today. And carrots, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with. There's kind of these more positive incentives, rewards, tax reductions, grants, etc. Sticks are more, restrictive or punitive measures, regulations, mandates, fines, and then sermons are more these information-based approaches, public awareness campaigns, education, kind of informing people about what's going on and hoping they'll change their behavior about it. To me, this kind of, looks like this. It's all kind of coming from externally, from the individual, kind of an outside-in perspective. And that's one thing I'm trying to question a bit. I mean, of course, this is a simplification to draw out a point, but what I'm trying to adopt in my thesis is more this perspective, the inside-out approach. And this is coming from work I was engaged in before my PhD on this emerging field called inner transformations for sustainability, where we basically try to bridge some insights from the more philosophical and humanistic traditions and social psychology, such as values, worldviews, paradigms, beliefs, that kind of stuff, and then link it to system change, basically. So we don't only want people to reflect about their values, it's also about actually spurring action that will address bigger systemic issues. So this is one paper I was part of writing before starting my PhD. So what I'm trying to do, kind of, how can we view this kind of more, adopt a more empowerment perspective that's informed by this inside-out perspective. And empowerment in a more traditional sense means to give power, but kind of basically to authorize rights, right? But in a sense, it's also about giving capacity and energizing actors to pursue their own interests or the collective interest of a group. And in this paper, Cognitive Elements of Empowerment, he talks about a few things, which you can a few psychological factors that you could consider if you want to, have this empowerment perspective. And one is impact. So can I feel that I can influence the outcomes of this process? Competence, are you capable to do this? Meaning, does this work matter to me personally? And choice, that can I choose how to do my work, basically. And this is again from management science, so trying to bring this into a governance field is also one of the things I'm trying to do, and look at it in relation to collective action. And this is kind of central concepts within, of course, most governance and environment management research. But basically, so apart from these more kind of behavioral approaches, this is more about people coming together, acting as members of a group with the aim of changing socio-political structures in the face of the climate crisis. So that's the kind of, I'm very my research, and as much of psychological research does is quite centered on the individual and her inner world, but here we're actually trying to link it to a kind of more systemic issue through the lens of collective action, basically. So it's different, and I'm trying to avoid this more methodological individualism where you only look at, changes within, that you assume that changes within an individual will automatically aggregate. It's more of a kind of antagonistic perspective on change, that people come together and challenge socio-political structures. And how does that happen? And then I'm not an institutionalist, but this is something I'm exploring right now, just kind of as how to build institutions for collective action, kind of coming from the Austrian tradition, looking at how, you know, these different both soft and both formal and informal institutions can actually be structured in a way to facilitate this sort of cognitive empowerment or psychological empowerment. I can give an example from Sweden, my country, about what I think is a kind of excellent example of a psychologically empowering institution for collective action. And that's it, Folkets Hus, which is translated to People's House, were kind of central hubs to the Swedish labor movement. And if you know anything about Sweden and the development of our welfare state, you'll know how central the labor movement was to facilitate that development, basically. But a big issue was that they didn't really they weren't granted access to different locations to host their meetings and so on. So they came together and bought up different houses and so on, and you know, fixed them up and made them into these locations where they met. And here they not only had, you know, formal meetings, but they had cultural events, they had educational events. They met with the Social Democratic Party, so you had this direct link between civil society and politics to kind of create these platforms to develop the political content of the party. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of broader view, not just kind of talking about formal stuff, but also education and cultural transformation. That was a big part of the labor movement, to actually educate people and to facilitate what's in German called Bildung, which is like this more kind of common knowledge that to become a good citizen, that you need certain virtues and capacities to be developed. They say in this joke that you could born and die in the labor movement, because they even formed like a cooperative funeral home for undertaker. So it's really like a whole project, not just political stuff, but also the personal stuff. And some of you might be familiar with this book, which kind of tracks the downfall of these sort of institutions, at least in the American context, but I think a lot of similar trends can be observed in other places of the world as well. Basically arguing that people stop going to these informal associations and events and clubs and so on. And that had a negative impact on what Putnam calls social capital, which is the kind of quality and the strength of social ties between people in a society. And this is problematic because it kind of undermines trust in society, and it also undermines certain civic virtues among people to come together, meet people that's not part of your filter bubble, for example, sit down and talk to people that maybe have different sort of opinions than you have. And I think today that's especially relevant. Yeah. And just kind of further emphasize why this is a problem. Also, the character of a democratic society will be revealed by the willingness of people to cope with problematical situations instead of assuming that someone else has responsibility for them. And this is, of course, especially important in the context of the climate crisis, which is usually described as a complex issue that defined as the number of variety of elements and interactions in the system, and this double complexity that there's both ecosystems and social systems involved, and the boundaries are hard to determine, the causal linkages are hard to establish, and there's more kind of perspectives that gets harder to prove or dispute. Some even go as far as calling it climate change a blanket issue, which is quite a common way of phrasing it, which is sort of an escalation or kind of further emphasis on this issue. Basically, the point here is that we won't really know for sure when we reach a sustainable society, I think is the gist of it. Apart like from, for example, getting a man on the moon. We will know when we have a man on the moon, but we won't know in the same way when we achieve a kind of sustainable society. Kind of phasing out fossil fuels will of course get us closer, but it's a bit contested what that actually means. And in response to this complexity, wickedness of climate change, a lot of local governments are recognizing the need to involve a lot of different stakeholders, realizing that they don't sit on all the answers themselves, that they need to kind of bring in different perspectives, different sorts of knowledges, different sorts of capacities, and especially kind of in the wake of for example, neoliberal reforms, which is weak in the public sector, that they might not have the same sort of resources anymore. So it was kind of a hard, more structural need to actually consider how can you engage local businesses and organizations. I situate my work in a governance literature which kind of talks about co-creation and collaborative governance, kind of recognizes this changing rhetoric in both theory and practice. And I would kind of conceptualize this as a form of participation. So it's a lot of different literatures and ways to conceptualize political participation, but here, because I can feel like sometimes the participation is basically like the municipality already has their understanding of a certain problem, and then they invite citizens to just come and kind of take part of that process, basically. I know that's kind of a simplification, but at some points, because co-creation more emphasizes shared problem framing and a lot of mutual learning, that the municipality don't come in with readily made answers, but they actually kind of recognizes that there's a learning process that has to happen in order to actually get a good collaboration going. A lot of it is on, trying solutions, experimenting, and having a more joint decision-making structure. Yeah.
So what is that for?
This is from one of my cases. I'm going to get into it later. But this is from Lund. So this is an initiative called Co-Action, which kind of gathers a lot of local actors to address a number of different challenges having to do with mobility, energy, and collaboration. Yeah. I read this funny thing in the intro of book Collaborative Learning that policymakers have in the past relied on the triple I model: invite, inform, ignore. Yeah. But one of the things with this is, of course, this is a bunch of people, right? So you actually have to consider the relational foundations of the relations between these people, and that's kind of where I come in. How do you facilitate trust, and what is mutual learning also on an individual level? But I'll get more into that soon. So a bit of background on the Swedish climate transition. A lot of our electricity is mostly like 99% fossil free. Most of it is hydropower, almost half of it, and then nuclear and wind. Our biggest kind of challenges are more in the industry and transport sectors. Both of those kind of accounts for 30% each. We've made a lot of progress in terms of heating facilities, heat pumps, replacing oil boilers, that kind of stuff. And now there's a big kind of industrial push in the north, especially to develop and scale fossil-free steel, which is a big challenge because steel requires very high temperatures to work with and melt. So you need a lot of energy for it. And to kind of meet that growing energy demand, the current government is very kind of hard on developing a nuclear power. Sweden used to be this very forerunner and climate leader, which I wouldn't say is the case anymore. Our emissions are going up currently, which they haven't done in decades, much due to current government policies, and much of it is from the mobility and transport sector, which is also the topic of my research, or the kind of sustainability problem that I address in my research. A bit on the local governance structure in Sweden. It can be kind of likened to a hourglass figure, in the sense of that you have a strong unitary state, then we have regions, and then we have very strong municipalities. And Sweden is quite unique in that sense because the kind of autonomy of municipalities are written into the constitution. They have taxing rights, including for income taxes, and they can kind of do as they please with it. They have a lot of responsibilities for welfare and planning. So there's a lot of kind of independence on how different municipalities organize their work. And of course, harmonizing EU policies are very important to Sweden. Right now, there's quite an interesting dynamic where the state is kind of falling behind on their ambition, but the municipalities and local governments and cities are still advancing the transition. In our times, with help with the EU funding and policy regulations. So it's an interesting multi-level kind of dynamic going on right now. Yeah, Sweden has quite geographically large municipalities, also worth mentioning. So some of the largest one. Yeah. There's about 290 of them in Sweden. And Sweden is a big country. I mean, not compared to Canada, of course, but yeah. Okay, so this is kind of where my research comes in. Oops. So climate goals becoming more clear, measurables, the fixed frames, but their achievement depends on these more flexible, soft, co-creative collaboration forms across sectors. No single actor has full authority, knowledge, or capacity, so we need to engage different actors in the process. And this is kind of following a modal shift in governance where more enabling forms are encouraged. Of course, still kind of interacting and coexisting with these old public administrative paradigms, such as bureaucratic structures and silos and that kind of stuff. So there's a kind of a bit of a conflict between those two one emerging and one the old and the emerging, basically. And these personal relational motivations remain a bit understudied here. And I'll talk more about that more here in a way to organize my research. I'm using the three spheres of transformation by Karen O'Brien, which just kind of recognizes that in order to achieve a kind of genuine transformation of society, we can't only look at the practical stuff, the behaviors and technical responses, EVs and wind farms, for example, but also the political stuff, which is more on the structures, what kind of structures the decision making and participation, but also the personal stuff. And personal is both on the individual and collective level. So values, motivations, and visions. I won't say too much on that. And it's kind of based on systems theory, leverage points. It's much more one can read about that, but I won't spend too much time on it for the sake of time. So yeah, this is basically what I'm trying to do with my dissertation. Basically trying to combine these two worlds of climate psychology and governance and political economy, where trying to bridge these two worlds basically. I'm writing a compilation thesis consisting of 5 papers. 2 are published, 1 got accepted yesterday. And 2 are 1 under review, 1 being formulated. And yeah, the titles are just getting longer, actually. Okay, and see, in paper 1 and 2, I'm just kind of setting up. So this is based on a survey, a mixed method survey, where I kind of just map different motivations from citizens in Sweden. And this one is more of a conceptualization paper about values. I'm not going to talk so much about that today, because I want to focus on these 2 papers, which is more about my empirical case study work. Here we go. So these are the cases we've studied. So one is this case called on works, and 2 other are coaction and cykelvänligt, which means most bike friendly, basically. These are comparable in the sense that they all seek to advance sustainability practices, sustainable mobility practices through collaboration between a municipality, local businesses, and organizations. So they try to mobilize voluntary collaboration for behavioral and organizational change rather than relying on regulation and market incentives. So working closely with the companies and representatives. And then, yeah, and they all kind of blend formal and informal activities. So work points. There's some different ways. I won't go too much into this. These are the different, but they're, one is a kind of temporary project funded through external money. One is an ongoing, one is an NGO. One is funded through a public procurement contract, which I found quite interesting that you can do that. One is kind of applied for the same funding that us researchers would apply for, basically, like from the same funder, basically. And that's quite new that the municipality actually applies for this much money externally. But that allows them to do a lot of stuff, but they also gives them quite a limited timeline, for example, compared to these two, which has a much lower budget, but a longer timeline. Yeah, so there's some interesting comparisons there. And across these 3 cases, we kind of wanted to know how can these networks actually facilitate engagement among the members and for climate action, what supports the participants' motivations to partake in these networks, And how can a network and its facilitator create a social environment that actually supports that kind of engagement and motivation among the participants. So it's both about understanding what is the role of these networks in the broader public decarbonization agenda, but also about how do you actually kind of create a good, engaging environment that people want to show up to and deem important enough to come back to. So I'll just share 4 key findings to make it manageable. The first one is as much of a premise as it is a finding, but the individuals are very important in these contexts. It's usually, so it's basically two dimensions to this, right? This one is the participants from the organizations and the local businesses, that's kind of members of the network. And then there's actually the facilitators and the coordinators that runs the networks. But starting with the participants, it's usually both of these groups represents, in some sense, organizational champions, right? They are the one that made sure that their network, that their company organization joined the network. So they kind of did the internal advocacy work to make sure that the network or that the organization joined the network. They are the one responsible for taking the learnings of the network and then trying to implement it in the organization. And usually it's not clearly written in their job description that this is an activity they should do, but they deem it important enough that they kind of stretch the boundaries of their mandates to actually get the companies involved here. And that's interesting to me because if you look at individuals, you can, instead of just looking at organizations and institutions, if you look at the individuals kind of inhabiting these institutions and organizations, you get a more kind of antagonistic and heterogeneous perspective on organizations and institutions. There's different wills and different kind of actors that navigates these organizations that seeks to enact change. My background, like from where I'm from before my PhD, was very skeptical to everything that had to do with the private sector, only looking at kind of social movements or the public sector basically. But there are a lot of kind of change agents in the private sector as well, if you kind of take this, big review, right? But it's kind of interesting. It's interesting in another way because a kind of common prescription that we researchers give is like we need more citizen participation. And one of the researchers at the institute said like basically how much do we expect citizens to partake in, like energy communities, consumer councils, like these in dialogues with the municipality, like who has the time to do all these things that we're asking them to do. So in a way, like this is looking at participation from their professional roles, is that which I found quite interesting and haven't seen a lot of research on that either. But we're basically looking at from that role instead of the citizen. And then the coordinators are also quite interesting to look at. In 2 of the cases, these are municipal officials, so they kind of, in a traditional sense, more like these bureaucrats. But I'll get back to why maybe that's not a fitting title anymore. But usually they have quite ambivalent, mandates in that we should reduce emissions this much in traffic in Malmö, and you're allowed to collaborate. And then you have to kind of interpret and mobilize resources and convene actors and kind of just through interpretation and navigating these different structures to actually make this happen. So it's not clear why these networks were formed. It's usually the work of a single kind of institutional entrepreneur, you could say. The second one is the role of learning, which is again recognized in the co-creation literature, but it's usually more talked about on the organizational level. But here I'm looking more at the personal level. So what do you actually need to do, or what actually needs to happen in order for it to become this more engaging environment? And then I identified these 3 forms of learning. So one is knowing the issue. And in my case, this is usually about commuting and mobility in the city, urban mobility and commuting practices. Commuting itself is quite an interesting issue because it kind of falls between the chairs of different responsibilities and different frameworks, like who owns the issue of commuting? Is it the businesses? Is it the municipality? Is it the individual kind of commuter? It transcends both the private and the professional and the public sphere. There's public infrastructure, but there's kind of individuals doing the trips to work, but that connects to other trips as well. So it's kind of an interesting case, and it also, of course, ties into bigger planning issues, that how do you kind of create a city which encourages more sustainable commuting practices? And to actually be able to talk about this issue, you have to develop a shared language around it. So one of the informants called this an orphaned issue. And orphaned issue don't really, like, how do you approach that? So there's a bit of learning that has to go on to formulate a shared language around that issue, basically. The second one is knowing each other. So kind of understanding where each person comes from, their mandates, what can they do in their profession or what can they not do? How does a municipality take their decisions? How does a business take their decisions? And so on. So kind of understanding the limits and the potentials in each person's mandates and their kind of more motivational driving forces as well. And then the final one is kind of here where values and the personal stuff comes in more. So knowing the possibilities. So a lot of people join these networks thinking that they would kind of try to implement more or try to learn stuff so they could implement more sustainable mobility practices in their organization. But then kind of having this dialogue with the city, they notice that there's actually kind of a bigger issue here about creating a attractive and desirable city. So if I can, do my part in helping the city understand how we can create a better walkable city, for example, then that ties on more to the systemic level as well. And that is a big source of motivation for most people because it moves the issue from being just a technical one, like how do we get people to take the car less, to how do we create a desirable city, to kind of plugs into this bigger level, which a lot of people found very meaningful. Yeah. And then personal relationships and informality matter a lot. In one of these initiatives, in the beginning, like the start, it just had a lot of meetings, a lot of meetings without a set agenda necessarily, just to establish that kind of informal basis. And there's a lot of emphasis on, having parties, having after works, having long coffee breaks, for example. Yeah. And then kind of making that as a kind of strategic issue that you actually have to build trust and relationships between people so you can create a community and a sort of shared identity which is external to their home organization. So that's interesting in a way that a lot of people come to the networks and just kind of vent about the management of their companies, for example, which so they kind of creates this separate identity, and a lot of people who comes to these networks might be the only persons working on sustainability issues in their organization. And so one informant, for example, said that usually sustainability is just like a checklist here for them in the organization, but through the network and kind of creating this community, you also kind of go into this this sustainability is something more than just ticking the boxes, basically. Yeah. The coordinators actively reflect about these issues, these more informal soft dimensions, even though it's never kind of pronounced or articulated in any sort of official job description or strategy. And I think this quote from one of the coordinators captures this quite well. It's one thing to get everyone to the same table, it's another to get them start pointing fingers at each other and start working together. And how do you do that? Is this the kind of work of a traditional municipal official, a bureaucrat, to do this kind of relational work, right? So that's quite new, and like stepping back, taking this more attentive role. And that kind of made me think about that this a very different kind of role from the traditional Bavarian bureaucrat, right, which is objective, standing a bit apart, to this more facilitating and relational role. We actually convene different people and make sure that give them mandate and space, facilitate knowledge exchange, creating enthusiasm for the issue, building personal relationship, creating a safe and trusting environment, conflict resolution. These are quite, specific and more personal capacities, which are not, traditionally associated with a bureaucrat, right? So boiling it down, you could kind of come to 3 principles that's important to create more engaging and motivating environments. One is ownership, one is learning, and one is relationship. And this corresponds very nicely to a framework from psychology called self-determination theory. So this is a kind of very prominent macro psychological framework that basically argues that for people to to feel well and to be engaged in an activity based on more volition and self-interest and kind of personal meaning, you need to consider these three needs. And one is autonomy, one is competence, kind of knowing that we can do something, being capable of doing something and having the opportunity to learn. So kind of finding that spot where you're challenged and you're putting your skills to something good, but you're also kind of learning. And then the relatedness, which is, you know, having your actions matter to a group and being able to seek support, basically. And this is interesting. I really like this last part because it really shows that motivation and this kind of getting people engaged is not just about this individual process, but it's actually about creating this kind of community and shared identity as well. So you could, in one of my papers, the one about acceptance, I'm kind of using self-determination theory as a framework of principles for engaging people in these networked collective action arrangements. So to foster autonomy, you should seek to create a member-driven and self-organized structure and content based on a sense of volition where members can shape activities, experiment, and take initiative. To foster relatedness, you want to create a supportive environment where there's a common goal and purpose, one's efforts matter to the group, and there's support to be received. And then competence, to use one's skills for something positive and have the opportunity for joint learning to build confidence and drive change. Yeah, I don't know, how are we on time?
We're doing okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you've got about the 15 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay, cool.
10 minutes.
Okay, yeah, should be good. So just kind of illustrate how this happens more practically. So some of the more concrete activities that some of these coordinators do, like one Malmo Works has these monthly lunches, for example, and there's a new member coming up to someone that the coordinator knows is a bit more quiet and introverted. She will deliberately choose to sit with that person, try to get him into the conversation. In coaction, they always make a point about introducing everyone in the room if there's a new member. So there could be like 30 people in the room and everyone introduced, like they would take the time from the schedule to do this. They, have a lot of kind of emphasis on these informal activities like lunches. Fika is a Swedish word. It's basically coffee and something nice to nibble on. So what you're doing over there, that's simply Swedish for you as well. Parties, live music, kind of making this a very deliberate aspect. And in the meetings of coaction, they will really emphasize that then we're gonna have fika and we're gonna talk and we're gonna mingle. It's gonna be great. That's kind of where the magic happens to them. And then, strategically countering these feelings of professional loneliness, which I kind of touched upon before, that a lot of people coming there, they're the only one in their organization that works with sustainability or mobility. It might just feel like a kind of add-on to the bigger organization's business model, but here's the kind of core issue, right? So that's important to actually elevate this to something more important and make it kind of normalize sustainability as the kind of core of your work, basically. So these kind of activities can foster this kind of sense of belonging, even friendship in some people, especially in coaction. Usually they talk about each other as friends. And that led to stuff like someone said that, I've been part of many of these sort of networks, but I've never kind of, here we share data, which I wouldn't share otherwise, like travel policy documents, stuff like that. Not like secrets, of course, but still, there's a bit of more trust going on here. Again, about this coming to the meeting and just ventilating about the problems of management and like, they're, blocking my proposals again about implementing this measure, and then having a more kind of eagerness to actually take part in working groups and so on. In the third initiative, this is a national initiative, so they do most of their stuff online. So here it's much harder to create that sort of environment. It's a bit hard to see the text, apologies for that. But so there's a large distance for some of the online meetings. There's a low budget, so you can't really put staff hours into making these sort of events. And the cameras are usually turned off, and that's kind of accepted. And that will, of course, not lead to this same kind of dynamic. People will check in, come to the meeting, and leave again. So external factors still matter. I always, in this kind of research, you always run into the issue like there's a lack of funding, there's a lack of time. and that kind of stuff. But to me, like, there's always going to be a lack of funding, and there's always going to be a lack of time. So to me, it's more interesting to look at what do actors do with the resources and constraints that they're faced with. So yeah, acknowledging this, but not focusing too much on it, basically. So yeah, if I can try to kind of fulfill one of the promises that was made in this introduction, if we want to think about more psychologically empowering institutional collective action, could be something like structures, designs, arrangements that enable groups to coordinate and manage shared resources or common goals and visions by strengthening participating individuals' sense of autonomy, competence, relatedness, and ultimately agency. Yeah, and there's about my paper 5 is basically based on this idea, but the traditional bureaucratic role versus this big rhetoric on collaboration. How do they kind of navigate these institutional ambiguities? There's a very interesting, especially like in these old kind of public administration paradigms, there's a very heavy emphasis on the distinction between politics and administration. But there's some interesting work which kind of shapes up that dichotomy a bit, and basically, approaching mandates, what you're allowed and not allowed to do, as more kind of social construction rather than a hard administrative limit. But those are some of the issues I wanted to explore in paper 5, but that's just being formulated right now. Yeah, so kind of coming back to this metaphor again, if we have these targets, we should reduce greenhouse gases this much. That's a frame, but what does it actually look like? Doesn't really say much about that. And this question mark to me also symbolizes a concept which have come to kind of entertain a lot, which is about reflexivity or reflection, not on the part of us as researchers, but actually, if you want to kind of act in an autonomous manner, you have to know what's important to you, right? You have to kind of know your core values, maybe you have to think about how to create a shared purpose, shared meaning, and so on. And that's kind of the question mark maybe symbolizes that, meaning that we need to consider these meaning-making processes in participatory action contexts. I think that was it. Yeah. So I'm here until mid-April. If you want to grab a coffee, please.
All right. That was fantastic, Gustav. I think you delivered on all the promises that you made. And if you didn't, I'm quite confident we're going to get to it in the Q&A here. I already see some hands starting to go up. Yeah, I just want to. I'd be more than happy for me or other folks from our team at Polis. There's a lot of overlap. I mean, just in this realm of how do you build trust and relationships, and who needs to be in the room, and when you've got a mix of levels of government and organizations and individuals, and ensuring that those are affected by decisions, have a say in decision making, and then what do those governance arrangements look like? I see our Polis co-director Kelly Bannister there is just saying maybe a Polis team lunch with Gustav. I think absolutely there's so many interesting examples from here in BC, which has a really different history than where you're looking, especially in terms of Crown government and Indigenous relationship. And when we talk about co-governance, that's really the frame that we're working in. And then ultimately, how does all of this lead to systems change? So I am going to open the floor to dialogue here. I'm going to start with a couple from in the room, and I think I'll do my best to bounce back and forth. Leah, you're kind of monitoring. Maybe you can just give me a sign as we have questions come in online. But I guess I'll just ask, as you raise your hand to ask a question, please introduce yourself, and we can start to build our own relationships here in the room. So Matt, you're first.
Thank you so much, Gustav. Again, my name is Matt, which is Matt for your convenience. I'm from the business school, also CFGS fellow. Very fascinating research. Thank you so much. Two quick questions. I hope you don't mind helping make sense of the graph that you put the value as a paradigm, which go like cover the other things. You put the practical things in the center. Because intuitively to me, maybe values, I'm gonna put it in the center because it will condition the practices, the things, and then go, peel off different layers of the onion. So I don't know. I would like to understand how you put value at the outside. Yeah,
This one.
yeah.
Yeah, the free spirits.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have to ask Karen O'Brien about why she figure like that.
Okay.
I've also thought about that, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a point to it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Second question, I think your findings are interesting. I just like to ask you, like, could you help me better, like, further articulate, because I think the sociologists have captured those findings for decades, right? In terms of individuals, in terms of in the larger social context of social construction. So, what could be the theoretical insights that you found from your studies?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is new? What is novelty from
Yeah.
your studies?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so from these two studies, I think one of the novelties lies in both. I mean, in the bigger picture, it's about combining these two fields, insights from social psychology and political science and governance and so on. And I know that that's something I wanted to explore more as well, the link between sociology and social psychology, because I know a lot of research in social psychology only looks at the individual more kind of predictive, like how can certain values predict policy preferences or consumer preferences. But I'm trying to take some of these insights from social psychology and look at them more as a kind of mobilizing factor to get people to take part in action. So not just that this kind of, yeah, again, like how can they mobilize people? And so I can't really speak so much about the relationship between social psychology and sociology more than I know that sociology, of course, emphasizes the collective more than the individual. But for example, this theory of self-determination theory is very kind of well established. There's a lot of research on it, but more in fields of like, management and sports and education and that kind of stuff. I haven't seen like there's a few paper which kind of uses it for sustainability transformations, but not any kind of bigger engagement with it. So I guess that's one contribution I could kind of point to as well. And then the collaborative aspect as well. I mean, there's a lot of research on networks, for example, but less on these newer forms where public and private and other types of actors all kind of come together in the same room. And then looking at the individuals, not just like the organizations, but kind of looking at the individuals partaking in these networks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, Kalpan.
Hi,
Can you
you know,
introduce
yeah,
yourself too?
I'm Kalpana. I'm a fellow with Borders and Globalization. I'm in my fourth year of PhD. I study cross-border networks. What we find interesting is how does your research address the dichotomy that exists in what a development framework looks like? The development framework that is conceived by the state, like what the larger idea of development, and then sustainability. I always find them kind of conflicting, because there is one way in which the state collaborates with, say, private businesses, corporates, and there's a need there, right? And then there is the sustainability debate that exists. And also in like public administration that you're talking about, the understanding of public administration is also it's the sustainability of the institutions more than the environment and such, right? So how do you navigate these kind of contradictions, and how does your research at all address that in one way or the other?
Yeah. So I'm like translating the dichotomy between, what would you say, development and sustainability, or was it more state?
Yeah, there's a conception of what development looks like, right?
Yeah. And
It's mostly extractive, to my understanding. The state majorly takes that way of being more extractive, right?
Yeah.
And then there is this whole dialogue about sustainability of the environment, and then the other debate that exists. So, where does your research kind of, does it address that at all? Does it want to, or what's
in terms of development, I guess it's not really development is something that, the global north conceives itself helping the global south. Do I feel like more? I don't see the Swedish state using development for its own kind of development, which is an interesting discussion in itself. To me, my mind would rather go to like, okay, what measures do we use to kind of advance? What are the major societal goals, basically? And that would be in GDP growth, for example. To me, like a kind of maybe post-growth or even degrowth perspective would be more helpful to look at those issues. But these are very like big questions, and my specific empirical cases might not touch upon those big levels, except that, one thing is, of course, the multi-level dynamic I mentioned when I talked about the Swedish local governance system, that now due to like, new kind of funding landscapes and so on, cities and municipalities can kind of draw on external resources, like applying for grants, like one of these did, to continue to advance climate action, even when the government is, stalling, basically. So I would say there's different kind of logics on these different levels. The state is one, and the local municipalities another. Yeah.
I see a couple more hands in the room. I also is Cynthia the only one online. Yeah, with a hand up. Okay, I'm gonna go to Cynthia online, and then we're gonna come back to Zach and give him your name.
Hi, Gustav. Thanks so much for your talk. My apologies for not being there in person. So I'm an historian, and you're interacting here with a very interdisciplinary audience. So I think we're all going from the perspectives of our disciplinary homes to your research. I appreciate very much your bringing up the importance of the labor movement in Sweden. And its role into the creation of the welfare state. And I think you're on to something looking at that example as both a comparative case of how to get the state to engage the way we want it to with the needs of the population that they're addressing. But I also think it's an important cautionary tale. So, we have the creation of the welfare state that comes out of this. Oh, am I still there anymore? But anyway, the idea being here that if we can look at the welfare state as an example of how to mobilize, but also the dismantling of the welfare state in the 1970s and the 1980s is what has led us to now have to rely much more on municipalities to do the hefty lifting that our central state would have done beforehand. So just a call out to reflecting again on that dynamic between the labor movement, welfare state, and then the dismantling of the welfare state and our reliance on municipalities. Also, while you're at UVic, if you haven't met him yet, you might wish to reach out to Simon Peck in the Gustavsson Business School. He works on participatory democracy and does some projects that I think would align with what you're interested in. So thanks again for your talk.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, I agree. Like, it's a good kind of historical comments. And I, of course, again, like kind of recognizes that a lot of this need for collaboration emerges from the weakening of the public sector as well, financially. And there's, of course, I'm mostly using this Folkets as an illustrative case, but I also know that the Social Democrats' view on local governance was very instrumental to the purpose of the state, which is quite like, this is a particular conception of what the role of local governments are, for example. So there's more to unpack there, definitely. I agree. But thank you for your comment.
Zach.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a member of Accelerating Community Energy Transformation here on campus. I'm the community planning lead in intelligent energy systems. So I'm also going to bring a very biased disciplinary lens to this comment and question. But first of all, thank you so much for expanding. We've had a couple of conversations about your research, Gustav. This was very helpful and comprehensive in terms of the history and content, and some of your findings especially resonated with me. I've been thinking a lot about artificial intelligence and the energy implications of it. Also energy opportunities that come alongside the massive infrastructure build out that is ahead of us. And you kind of closed on this idea of agency. And that's the central theme of being proposed here in this intelligence revolution is the idea of agentic automation of almost everything. And that could very well include a lot of these day-to-day interactions and these relational opportunities between people. So I guess my question is like, can you see this as anything other than just a threat to the foundations of your research? Because when I hear this, I'm simultaneously thinking like, wow, this is so tragic. We could lose so much of this interpersonal connection and the importance of that relationality in our day-to-day lives. And then the other side of my brain is like, if any of these models are going to actually help us in the long run, they need exactly these types of principles and these mechanisms built into their own foundations so that we can have that individual sense of self, but also like that continuous learning opportunity, relationships, opportunities informally, and then like how do we govern that new model where it's not just people, but it's people with like a massive automated force or like this data center of geniuses or like how does your work inform that next phase of potential? Or do you see this just as like it's a threat, let's avoid that future altogether?
I guess it depends. I mean, my answer is going to be purely speculative, yes, because it's outside the scope of my thesis.
Crystal ball.
Exactly. Thank you. But what I kind of immediately came to mind is again like these three spheres of transformation, right? So I mean, if you don't change or address the personal sphere, the values upon which the system operates, which in my kind of view, with the rollout of artificial intelligence, still very much premised on these more neoliberal values, such as like efficiency, optimization, profits, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a good example that if you roll out artificial intelligence, which is more like a practical sphere target, without addressing the personal ones, you might have these threats that you talk about. But I mean, there's artificial intelligence, and then there's collective intelligence, which is our kind of collective sense making and so on. And as I kind of touched upon in my introduction, seems to have lost a lot of those institutions for collective sense making as well. So in a way, I mean, it has to be a reintroduction of those sort of meeting spaces and just this dialogue, this question mark, right? What kind of values do I really want to pursue in these big societal changes, and having that kind of connection between the political and the personal. I guess again, I think this focus use, which I talked about, is such a good example, because today, and kind of touches on paper 5 as well about the role of municipal officials. Are they like the democratic legitimacy issue here? Traditionally, the kind of channel between civil society and politics are through the parties, right? And in Sweden, I think about 86% of our population goes and votes every year, which is great, every election, which is great. But there's always almost nobody coming and joining the parties anymore. So you have quite in my interpretation, quite a hollow democracy in that sense, that you have professional politicians, but the kind of lifeline between, citizens and politics, if there's no membership in the parties anymore, what happens to that collective sense-making process, basically? Those are my 2 cents.
We should talk more.
All right, over to you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. And by the way, I listened to all of it because I was not in Zoom before arriving late. So, I'd like to build on the present question from Cynthia.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My name is Jules. I'm a PhD student working with the Constellation of Truth project. We study the role of non-governmental organizations in society in reframing the discourse around borders and migration.
Discourse of?
Around borders and migration.
Okay.
So we have like a deep interest in the role of non-governmental organization in reframing of discourses and the way organization people can intervene within the debate or within the policy. And I really appreciate how you drew a parallel between the role of the people's houses and the labor movement in getting to the welfare state that Sweden had at some point and it's maybe losing as everyone is. And my question is, before I forget it, is how is encouraging citizens to participate in public administration different from neoliberalism?
Well, one more time.
How is encouraging citizens to participate more in public administration different, a break with neoliberalism, in the sense that Andrews Malm has theorized that like civil movement that have remained pacifist in their collective actions have constantly been defeated without escalating and trying to recalibrate the power imbalance.
Yeah.
The labor movement has tried to invest the parliamentary sphere and dialogue with the political parties, but also invested a lot of effort and resources in disrupting in recreating the power balance and like making people accountable to a point that they can't escape it, even if the legal systems allow it.
Yeah.
And in participation, one of the problems that everyone that has done some sort of citizen participation with public administration can feel is, at the end of the day, if they want to say no, they can.
Yeah.
But they can claim that they did participation.
Yeah.
And they like that word. It sounds really nice. And so I'm wondering at what, how much encouraging this type of participation is a break with the system that we complain to have now.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. I mean, how co-creation, this kind of other collaborative public administration paradigm, how that's different from the neoliberal new public management, for example. New public management is more about, viewing citizens as clients. So the local government is more like a service deliverer, while co-creation, the ambition at least, and it's always a difference between theory and practice, right? It actually involves citizens as co-creators, basically. I mean, that's the ambition, and then of course, yeah, how successful is it? And what's the potential, and so on. That's a very big question that I won't be able to answer, I guess. I think what's a bit liberating with, and I run into this kind of criticism quite a lot, that if you only focus on individuals, you're not really addressing the systemic level. But in a way, trying to kind of move away from the dichotomy between individual versus system and so on, and kind of seeing it more as how is this kind of part of a bigger process, definitely, basically. And then if you look at and take a more kind of antagonistic perspective or agonistic or whatever you want to call it, then you can look at, in which ways does this challenge these kind of collaborative forms, challenge dominant structures, for example. But I can't really say anything about how it actually addresses the bigger picture, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I believe Sam, there was a local government official in college, and just on public engagement. I wondered if your research, have you looked at citizens' assembly specifically as a method of public engagement?
No, there are a few going on. There's a few public ones, and there was a national one in Sweden. So there's work on it with people I know. But if it's kind of like energy communities, people are researchers just flocking on these innovations. So there's almost more research than practice going on in these cases. So it felt a bit like it's super interesting, but it's also, tends to be a bit over research almost, I think. But there's some interesting stuff going on there, especially in relation to this fifth paper I'm writing, that it seemed like the relationship between politics and administration, right? So usually it's the municipal officials that initiate, at least in Sweden, they initiate these sort of assemblies. And that could, this is just a hypothesis, a very kind of loose thought, that could kind of give them the mandate that they don't get from the politicians. They can say, we did this assembly, the citizens said, these are some good proposals, and that kind of gives us a mandate to pursue those policies, which you wouldn't get from the politicians.
Okay, I was curious, that photo you had earlier, it looks like city council meeting or something?
Yeah.
Was that staff or was that citizens or was that?
Professionals, and this was a co-action, so it's professionals and businesses and organizations.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go online to Kelly Bannister.
Hi, Gustav. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Kelly Bannister. I'm co-director of the Polis Project on Ecological Governance. And I want to officially invite you out for a Polis lunch, but it has to be in early April because I'm away and for most of March. So hopefully we can, Laura can maybe connect with you on that. My work is in applied intercultural ethics. But I could have given your talk, not that I know all that you know, but the questions you're asking, the angles you're searching, it's all really exciting and familiar to me. And, it's like a different doorway into the same house of what we're really trying to get at. So I'm excited to talk to you. But something caught my attention. And so the approach I take in applied intercultural ethics related to biocultural diversity, and largely working with Indigenous communities and ecological governance, I really take as kind of the premise along the lines of what I think Mac was pointing at, where the values, the beliefs, our worldviews are really sort of central, our ethos, central to our behaviors and impacting us more than most of us understand or probably even want to believe. So another realm that I really look into very actively is the neuroscience, the neurobiology, and even the embodiment, the way we embody our moral cognition, the way we make our decisions. So, complementary to what you're doing. In my work with Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations, I was admiring how what you're asking and where you're kind of pointing and asking the questions is taking us closer to, closer to governance structures, to worldviews that are built that are built on different kind of premises and values and beliefs and systems, et cetera. So that when in one of your slides you had the word "new" in quotes, and it was in reference to co-creation or collaborative governance for as a new paradigm for public administration. And I have my own sort of way that "new" struck me, and I was all right, it was the vibe, right? The vibe transmitted. But then I thought I don't want to assume what you meant by "new." So could you elaborate a little bit about why "new" got the quotes? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I forgot to say that, but a lot of papers on governance will usually introduce themselves with this shift from government to governance and these new forms. And I did that once in a paper and cited something from beginning of 2000s. And then another PhD student just kind of called me out on it, like how old can something be for it still to be called recent, right? So it's more like, I mean, in one way it's new, but in one way it's not. That, it's not like all of a sudden municipalities realize that they have to collaborate with different stakeholders. And maybe that's one of the kind of things that annoys me with interdisciplinary research, is that we kind of keep on reinventing the wheel with new words. So there's like network, adaptive, collaborative. There's so many adjectives added to governance today, and we go back different kind of timelines. But so in a way it's a continuation, and in a way it's something new. But
So you put the quotation marks to be safe, so you wouldn't be called out by your colleagues. Okay, so I want to probe your knowledge base when we meet for lunch, perhaps, about if there's more to that, because I can understand that pragmatic. I don't want to get called out. It's new, but there's so many reasons. There's so many ways to feel into why this is not new at all. And in fact, how did we stray so far away from where? From our understanding of the relational dimensions of what it even means to be human, let alone build our institutions. So I just wondered if there was something a little bit more.
Maybe it relates a bit to this historical comments about it's we're trying to do the same thing, but in a radically different institutional landscape today than was back with the labor movement had its time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to lunch.
Yes. Me too.
Right, were there any other questions in the room? Or is this the last call here or online? I should extend. Okay, well, Gustav, thank you so much. This was a really rich dialogue and presentation and dialogue and discussion. Yeah, like Kelly, I'm sort of, chomping at the bit a little bit. I can see so many kind of just a richness of overlap. And I had the same thought as Kelly in terms of some of your foundational work, and then you can see the ways that you take it off into your direction with your case studies and the way that we've taken it off in our direction at Polis. And so I really look forward to that follow-up. And I suspect there'll be other follow-up from some of the specific individuals in this room. Thrilled that you're here until mid-April. I don't know when you arrived, but welcome. Okay, yeah, welcome. And yeah, on that note, we'll wrap up today's global talk. Thank you everybody for being here, both online and in the room. Oh, there's some nice comments coming in for you that you should definitely see there from the folks online. All right, check your newsletter, and we'll see you all next time.